The decision made without consensus. There was no agreement in the room, not even close. Advisors sat around the table with sharply different conclusions, each backed by logic, experience, and conviction. And yet, the president knew the decision could not wait for unity. History rarely does. Consensus is comforting. It spreads responsibility. It softens blame. But inside the White House, there are moments when consensus becomes a liability rather than a strength. When urgency demands action and alignment refuses to arrive, leadership is forced into its most exposed position. The situation had been building for weeks. Briefings grew longer. Recommendations multiplied instead of narrowing. Each department saw the problem through its own lens, producing strategies that made sense individually, but clashed collectively. What emerged was not confusion, but fragmentation. Everyone was right about something. No one was right about everything. The president listened as the debate circled the same ground repeatedly. Each proposal solved one risk, while amplifying another. Military options promised deterrence but threatened escalation. Diplomatic approaches preserved relationships but risked appearing passive. Economic tools offered leverage but carried unpredictable domestic consequences. The room was full of expertise, yet empty of agreement. What made the moment dangerous was not disagreement itself, but time. External pressures were accelerating. Signals from allies grew inconsistent. Adversaries began testing boundaries more openly. The longer the White House waited for alignment, the more momentum shifted elsewhere. At a certain point, the president stopped the discussion, not to silence it, but to acknowledge reality. Consensus was not coming, and waiting for it would mean allowing others to define the outcome. This was the burden no committee could carry. A decision had to be made knowing it would divide the room, invite criticism, and concentrate responsibility in one place. The presidency is designed for exactly this moment, not to reflect agreement, but to act when agreement fails. As the room grew quiet, the weight of that responsibility became unmistakable. This was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning with leadership itself. And in that silence, the president prepared to choose alone. The discussion resumed, but its tone had changed. Advisors were no longer trying to persuade each other. They were trying to be heard by the one person who would ultimately decide. Each recommendation now came with unspoken acknowledgement. If chosen, it would define not only policy but accountability. The president asked each advisor to restate their position one final time, not with qualifiers, not with hedging, just the core logic. Stripped of compromise, the exercise was revealing. When reduced to essentials, the divide became sharper, not narrower. The paths forward were mutually exclusive, and the cost of blending them would be incoherence. One advisor warned that decisive action would fracture alliances already under strain. Another countered that hesitation would signal weakness at precisely the wrong moment. A third emphasized domestic consequences, cautioning that public trust could erode if the rationale was not immediately understood. Each concern was valid. None canceled the others out. What emerged was not a solution, but a pattern. Every option required sacrificing something fundamental: influence, stability, credibility, or time. The idea that leadership could preserve all four dissolved under scrutiny. The question was no longer which option was best, but which cost the administration was willing to bear. The president leaned into the silence that followed. This was a space where leadership becomes visible, not through command, but through acceptance. Acceptance that expertise does not guarantee clarity. Acceptance that disagreement does not imply failure. Acceptance that responsibility cannot be distributed when outcomes diverge. As the room waited, external updates continued to arrive. None changed the underlying reality. Momentum was building outside the White House, indifferent to internal debate. The longer the administration delayed, the more it ceded control to events already in motion. One advisor finally acknowledged what everyone felt. Waiting for consensus had become its own decision, and not a neutral one. It favored inertia. It favored reaction. And it carried risks no one in the room was willing to own. The president understood then that consensus had reached its limit. It clarified the risks, exposed the trade-offs, and tested every assumption. What it could not do was choose. That task remained singular. The conflict was no longer between advisors. It was between action and delay. And only one person in the room could resolve it. The president took a breath, knowing that whatever came next would leave some voices unheard, some advice unheeded, and some relationship strained. Leadership does not erase disagreement. It absorbs it. And in that moment, the decision moved from debate to destiny. The conflict reached its peak when the president asked a question no one wanted to answer. What happens the day after this decision is made? Not the press response, not the political fallout, but the operational reality once the consequences begin to unfold. The room shifted. Advisors stopped defending positions and started confronting outcomes. One path would trigger immediate reaction abroad, forcing rapid escalation management. Another would slow the crisis, but at the cost of credibility that might never fully recover. A third would preserve flexibility now, while creating vulnerabilities that would surface later, when response options were narrower. Each scenario carried a different kind of damage. None could be avoided entirely. The idea that leadership could minimize loss without choosing where to fall was finally abandoned. This was the moment when abstraction collapsed into consequence. Tension sharpened as the president pressed further. Who absorbs the cost first? The public, allies, markets, future administrations. The answers were direct, uncomfortable, and honest. This decision would not distribute pain evenly. It would concentrate it. Silence followed, heavier than before. The debate had exhausted its usefulness. The conflict was no longer intellectual. It was ethical. Choosing one path meant accepting responsibility for harm that could not be undone, and not choosing meant allowing harm to unfold without direction. The president recognized the inflection point. This was the edge where leadership stops being consultative and becomes solitary. Advisors had fulfilled their role. They had mapped the risks. They had warned, argued, and clarified. What remained could not be solved collectively. The weight of the presidency settled fully into the room, not as authority, but as accountability. This decision would not be remembered for the process that led to it, but for the outcome produced. History would not ask who agreed. It would ask who chose. The conflict resolved itself in a quiet, irreversible way. The president understood that consensus was never the goal. Responsibility was. And responsibility, by its nature, belongs to one. The moment had arrived, not for agreement, for action. The president made a decision without asking for final approval. There was no vote, no summary of agreement, just a clear directive, delivered calmly, accepting the consequences that would follow. In that moment, the absence of consensus stopped mattering. Responsibility had found its place. Some advisors felt immediate unease. Others felt relief, not because the choice was comfortable, but because uncertainty had finally ended. Direction, even imperfect, replaced paralysis. The White House moved forward, no longer divided by debate, but aligned by execution. Orders were issued carefully. Messaging was calibrated to avoid escalation without disguising intent. Contingency plans shifted from hypothetical to active. The decision did not erase risk, but organized it. That alone changed everything. In the hours that followed, reactions began to surface. Allies recalculated. Markets responded. External actors adjusted posture. None of it unfolded exactly as predicted. But the administration was no longer reacting blindly. It was steering within the consequences it had chosen to accept. Inside the White House, the atmosphere changed. The tension of indecision gave way to the pressure of follow-through. This was leadership's quieter phase, where outcomes are shaped not by the decision itself, but by the discipline that follows it. The president understood that this part would define the legacy just as much as the moment of choice. Looking back, the decision would later be described as controversial, risky, even divisive. But those descriptions would miss the deeper truth. The hardest leadership moments are not defined by unity, but by clarity, by the willingness to act when agreement proves impossible. Consensus can guide. Debate can inform, but neither can replace responsibility. When the moment arrived, the president did not choose what everyone supported. They chose what they believed the country could carry. History rarely records how divided the room was. It remembers whether someone was willing to decide when no one could agree. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new. The